I'm David Bick. I'm with Genomics England, and I'm going to run this panel. I wanted to say a few words about the Liberty Fund event that we were part of. And what I'm going to do is talk a little bit about the Liberty Fund, a little bit about the event, and I'm going to ask each of the participants to say a little bit about themselves and about the programs that they're particularly working on, because I think it'll give all of you a feeling for what did the group look like that met. In addition to this panel of individuals, there were folks who were knowledgeable about law and ethics, and so the panel discussion got into a variety of topics. So the Liberty Fund was founded by Pierre Goodrich in 1960. It runs educational programs actually worldwide. We were one of actually what's going to be 100. They run about 100 of these a year around the world. And they've developed this sort of format where it's a small group discussion. And so this is part of the group. There was a total of maybe 16, 18 folks in the room. And their particular interest is the issue of how liberty and responsibility in free society intersects with government, business, science. And so in our case, they were interested in that question of liberty and responsibility in a free society in conjunction with the potential for newborn screening programs. So you can imagine that there were some quite interesting discussions. I'm going to sit down now and ask Stephen to introduce himself and a little bit about what he does, and then we'll go on to some more questions after we've had each person.
I was hoping you were going to ask me last. That would have given me a minute to gather my thoughts. Okay, so ungathered thoughts.
Just about who you are. And just okay. All you have to do is talk about who you are and what you're sort of doing right now, and then I will torture you with other questions later.
All right, fair enough. Thank you. I'm Stephen Kingsmore, and I head up one of the programs. It's called Beginnings, and it proposes to use whole genome sequencing in newborn babies, all newborn babies, to examine whether or not they may or may not have about 500 diseases. And these are all diseases that I believe Dr. Howell would say, yes, those fit our RUSP criteria. We believe that they are. So they all have effective therapies, and they're all serious illnesses. And if we delay treatment for very many of these, the children have organ failure or death. So that's our group.
Holly?
Okay, I'm Holly PA. I'm from RTI International, and I co-lead the Early Check study, which is an existing study that we conduct in North Carolina in collaboration with our State Laboratory of Public Health and our clinical partners at UNC and Duke, where we currently are screening for CKMM. It's one of the Duchenne studies that Rod mentioned. And we are looking to a significant expansion where we are going to offer 2 sequencing panels, again, to the entire state of North Carolina. We really enjoy the challenge of trying to recruit an entire state, and we do that through a lot of interesting recruitment and consent. We use electronic consent. So these issues of how you consent a large number of people into a study like this or into public health down the road is something that we're very interested in as well. We expect that we would launch our study in the spring to summer of 2023.
Nick? I think you're on.
Am I on? Okay. My name is Nick Encina. I'm currently, I help run the Precision Population Health Program at Ariadne Labs. I was formerly Chief Science and Technology Officer there. Ariadne Labs is a joint venture between Harvard School of Public Health and Brigham and Women, and we focus on health system innovation. Effectively, how do you roll out new clinical and medical innovations to health systems in a way that they can adopt and sustain long-term and do so in a safe and responsible way. So we have programs in palliative care and in newborn, maternal and fetal health, primary care, and so on. And the reason why we're in genetics is because we looked at it from a population health standpoint and recognizing what an impact genomic medicine has had in specialty care, and yet it's just making the bridge over into primary care and population health. And so we feel that we can accelerate that by creating tools, simple tools, checklists, conversation guides, things that are scalable worldwide that can help in bridging that chasm between where genomic medicine is today and where it could be if we're going to use it in preventative care, which is at population levels.
Lily, you want to jump in?
My name's Lillian Downey. I am from Melbourne, Australia, from the Murdoch Children's Research Institute. I work as a clinical geneticist in a paediatric and in a prenatal setting, and recently completed my PhD modelling genomic newborn screening. So I'm an early career researcher and a chief investigator on a new study, which very disappointingly doesn't have a name yet, that I could bring to you, where we're going to be rolling out a genomic newborn sequencing research program for about 1,000 babies in our state.
Alessandra?
Okay. Hello, everybody. Thank you. So my name is Alessandra Ferlini. I'm a medical geneticist. I'm MD, so I'm also a neurologist, and I did my PhD in London at the Imperial College. I'm medical genetics is involved in many activities, so I have a lot of diagnostics at my site. I'm the head of the genetic medical genetics unit at the University of Ferrara, so in Italy. And I work in rare disease field for many years, but I'm here today because I have the pleasure, the honor to be involved in the Screen for Care project. I coordinated the Screen for Care project together with Nicolas Garnier. You will know more tomorrow about the Screen for Care. And this is our research project funded by EU in this novel frame of collaboration between academics and pharma companies. And we have the aim, of course, this is a research project, so that the idea is to try to validate which can be the best, or probably more than one, approach for genetic newborn screening in rare diseases. So, and you probably will know more tomorrow. Thank you.
Awesome. You gave a very good teaser for tomorrow. So Alessandra, I'm going to start with you. I had never been at a conference like this and I didn't even know what the Chatham House rules were. And now I'm going to say what they are because I had to look them up. The notion is that you have a discussion where you share information, but after that discussion, you use that information that you learned from that discussion. You go out into the world, but you never reveal who said what about what. And so in sort of more rarefied, maybe policy circles where people have, big responsibilities and big egos, and then when Chatham House rules are applied, in theory, there's more honesty in those settings because you can feel comfortable that you're not going to be quoted afterwards. So the part that I was going to ask you to start us off with is maybe, having been 8 hours with all of us and with some other very interesting folks whose knowledge about ethics and law, was totally amazing. So what was it that you sort of found interesting, as you sort of reflect back on, what were the parts and things that you heard that sort of interested you, and you sort of said, oh, well, that's sort of an interesting thought or an interesting concept, and just sort of, how did it feel to be involved in sort of a program like that? Because for me, it was absolutely unique. I'd never been involved in anything like this before.
Well, many, I have to say. So the first, my first feeling was that probably yesterday I had more questions after the meeting than before. So if I may say something that is provocative, okay? And that's good, very good in my view, because that's research and is what we should do in research. So have much more questions than, and possibly answers, hopefully at the end. So it was very interesting also to have this interdisciplinary approach that is not multi, because multi does not implicate cross interactions. That's my personal interpretation. Interdisciplinary is that you are sharing views among people with very different background, and you try to understand each other. Fact that is not easy, not to me. Indeed, yesterday I was a little bit confused sometimes because legal issues, philosophical aspects, which are definitely important for our, common idea of newborn screening, genetic newborn screening. Well, that was a little bit confounding, but, inspiring also somehow, if I may say. As aspect that I mostly found interesting, but from my perspective, is obviously the point of data. And because where I am a medical geneticist, so, and if you do genomics, if you do sequencing, if you do genomic analysis, we are going to generate a huge amount of data. And even more problematic, if we may say, screening thousands and thousands of infants. This is going to be even more complex because we have many data from many people. So my personal question with the question mark at the end is, how are we going to manage to curate this data and to define who is the owner? We have discussed that with Stephen and all of us yesterday of this data. I think that this is a very important aspect related to genetic and genomic newborn screening. And I stop here.
No, that's absolutely fantastic. I mean, that really was an important theme of ownership that was absolutely brought out in huge detail. And so the opportunity was to bring some of these concepts sort of into high relief, because there was this exchange back and forth, and you had more time than you usually have in a conference where you stand up, give your talk, someone else gives their talk, and there's really no exchange. So Lily, it's your turn.
Thank you. I personally found the process very challenging in a good way, because I think when you're trained in a medical profession and then you're in a scientific community and then you work in a busy hospital and all the types of settings, or a public health service like we work in, when you have a meeting with people, particularly important people who have lots of time pressure, you're used to sitting down with an agenda, minding what you say, because you've got to keep to time and you have to produce outcomes. So I think it was a really novel experience to come from that background and be able to sit and have time and not really have a clear direction to go in, which was hard, but also positive because we went in really interesting directions. And to be able to really feel comfortable saying your piece, because there was a queue, so you couldn't respond to people when you felt like you wanted to. You had to wait, let that idea rest, and wait your turn to voice your own opinions. But I found that a really valuable process, and one that was, although we talked a lot about genomic newborn screening, which is what we're all here for, it sort of, I think, also left with me a few lessons about how to generate ideas within the team back home and how to let people sit with some bigger ideas that you're talking about and maybe be more productive when I go back and have meetings. I thought that was really valuable.
And actually what you said, it really does resonate with me. And actually you've now taught me something, because I sensed it then, but you really articulated this notion that you could bring back this process and use it in your own life with your own laboratories and your own folks. It really, that's an awesome lesson. Nick?
Yeah, for context, I guess one of the things that I'll describe is what happened. There was 18 of us, roughly half from the newborn sequencing world and half ethicists, philosophers, and they sat us all in a square, right, with a big hollow in the middle, so we could all see each other, with these Socratic approaches and raise your hand. And what was really interesting was that they educated us all beforehand. They gave us a really well-made professional packet with some of the most critical readings that they could compile based on early Human Genome Project, genetics, newborn sequencing, ethics, law, and so on, so that the principle there is that for as expert as everybody is in their field, you can't assume that everybody knows everything that the other people know. So it gave us all a baseline to come to the table and say, okay, we can have a discussion on these topics that are going to be very complex, but at least with a general understanding of where we're coming from. And so I found that to be interesting. That hand raise was also interesting, and I think it was frustrating at first because somebody Sandra could say something, and I'm like, oh. But you can't just respond. You have to raise your hand. You go in a queue of like 10 people. So by the time it gets back to you, we've covered 10 different subjects. But I think what that helped was in a couple of different areas. Number one, it made it so it wasn't confrontational. For as much as I may disagree, by the time I got to my point, I had time to calm down and say, like, I respectfully disagree. Let me explain how. I think it also gave a voice to everybody at the table because, loud voices tend to dominate the room. In this case, everybody had an equal say, and everybody really shared their opinion throughout the whole system. And then the last thing I would say that really was interesting was having the philosophers and ethicists at the table with an understanding of genomics. Some of them actually spent time in medicine, and that was interesting because having all of us there, we recognized that we're all tackling similar problems. So it was great to have that conversation. But then it was also interesting to hear from their perspective, which is that a lot of the problems we're facing aren't entirely new. They've seen them before. In fact, some conversations went back to Aristotle and the issues they were having there around privacy in medicine. And so it was interesting to see how society has tackled these things, the solutions they came up with, and some open questions that are still out there. But then it gave us all a forum to have a conversation and build bonds, especially after COVID, seeing each other in person, and now we can take on into collaborations, discussions, papers together, and so on. So I found that to be a really refreshing experience.
And it was sort of amazing because they brought this group together with an agenda of topics and some very interesting readings, but the output of the program, the work product, was just to have the discussion. There's no paper, there's no compilation of what we did or said or any of that stuff. It was just the work product was the conversation itself. Holly?
So it was a very interesting experience, and I think I neglected to say what my background is. So I actually do have a background in bioethics. I'm a social behavioral researcher, and I have clinical training in genetic counseling, but I also have a bioethics background. And it was very interesting to see that intersection. And I think a couple of things that I came away from that discussion was the real challenge of defining terms and concepts and the critical importance that that's going to play in us being able to continue to have these detailed conversations among interdisciplinary groups, but also with the public. There was a lot of discussion about how do we have these engagements with discussion with the public. Well, we need to define terms so we can describe them amongst ourselves. So terms such as what does treatability mean, right? The other thing I thought was really interesting wearing my clinical bioethics hat was the sort of tensions that the discussion raised, the difference in the ethical principles that underlie research pilots of sequencing, which is what we're proposing to do, and those that underlie state newborn screening. The ethical principles that drive those, underlie those two institutions are somewhat different and at some point seem to compete in our discussion. So I think we didn't come out with a to-do list, but I have my own to-do list. And I think, one of those is really having a very clear, thoughtful discussion that continues about whether and when sequencing would move from a research focus into newborn screening, into state newborn screening. And so I think that's something that's really important. That would be a continued discussion for this group.
And that is very clear. And I hope that's been clear at this conference, because it was clear here, is that, again, this notion of freedom and liberty, right, and responsibility in a free society, and an elective choice by families to join a research program, and what then happens if you want to make it state mandated? What does that mean? What does that mean? And so that was one of those kind of like, oh yeah, kind of moments. Stephen.
Yeah, I wrote down a couple of things, David, which really surprised me. The actual format meant that we had time to collect our thoughts. So as you've heard, you had to get in a line to actually speak. And that really elevated the quality of the discourse, because you had a few minutes to rehearse in your head what it was you were trying to say. And you had to remember that this conversation was going like this, okay? It wasn't doing that. And nearly every scientific conversation does that, as you spoke to. And so by the time you made your comment, you were responding to something 5 minutes ago. So this really elevated the quality of the discourse. I was really struck with some things. So first of all, people were very thoughtful. Second of all, we kind of checked our egos at the door. There just wasn't ego in the room. Amazing. The philosophers forced us to go back to first principles. They wanted to know the why behind the why behind the why. We all wanted to talk about the what and the how and the when. And they took us back, in fact, to the 12th century at one point, which even I don't remember. David thankfully does. So.
I do. I do. It was, and actually, I will laugh. It actually, there was a section from some work from Maimonides, but another day.
And the thing that came across because of this was a sense of empathy, right? It forced us to really think through the patient journey. And what came across most clearly to me was the heart of each person. I came away with a sense of, I'm still not really sure what you're going to do, or how many people you're going to do it to, and which room in the house you're going to do it in, but I know your heart. I know what's driving you, which was very, very precious, I think. And then the last thing was we were converged. There were very few points of disagreement, actually. We do have differences, but we're very convergent in terms of what we're trying to accomplish.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think all of these and exactly what you said about the sort of convergence was actually sort of amazing, because we hadn't all been in a room together to chat about this. We had been on Zoom calls and stuff and sort of had an idea. And I think some of that convergence, just to editorialize, was because we've lived in the clinical space and lived with patients and worked with patients. And that gives us a sense of like, what does mom and dad want? What do mom and dad want? So I know we only have a few more minutes, because I do not want to get between this group and the party. But I thought, I would take the prerogative of asking each of you, sort of like, as you thought about that meeting, what sort of, did it change, emphasize, sort of energize your vision of what we're going to be doing for newborns? And so, since I tortured Alessandra first, I'm going to torture Holly first. Just when you thought it was safe, because you thought I was going to do Stephen, right? I know you did.
That's good. Keep us on our toes. Yeah. All right. Something that I found very reassuring was I was keeping a list as we were going through, because meetings like this tend to raise problem after problem after problem. But the group was very good about also raising potential solutions or facilitators. And so when I went back and looked at my notes, I actually realized that for almost every barrier or problem that we identified, we also identified a potential, at least, route to a solution, which I found to be extremely positive.
Fantastic. Nick?
Yeah, I think that, one of the things that I took away the most was how intentional we have to be about messaging and educating the public about this. As scientists, we often do a horrible job at it because it's an afterthought, and we take for granted what we know and think that others will just get it and see the value in it, versus either misunderstand it or misconstrue it, or some people using it negatively. And so I think that a big takeaway for me was being intentional about how this is messaged, and potentially doing so. I mean, most of the world leaders in newborn sequencing are here, right? You could almost envision agreeing on how we're going to do this, whether you're in England, the UK, or UK, US, or Australia, or anywhere in between. And so I thought I took that away as something that we should focus on, and something that is doable, given that, like, at this point, we all have this common interest.
Yeah, I mean, we all got them in a room, and in some ways we sort of developed a shared vision, and that's a fantastic sort of vision of the future that we can coalesce around some ideas. Lily?
I came away from it feeling very inspired for the project that we're going to do, and excited that I was involved in it. But also, it was really nice to know that everyone in the room, echoing what you said, David, was coming back to the end goal. So we'd have lots of kind of far out conversations about things, but at some point, every single person in the room, I think, brought it back to our end goal, which was to make a positive impact on families and babies and mums and dads. And that was a really nice common thread through the meeting.
And Stephen, I'm going to have you go because I want to give Alessandra the last word. Because I like you.
Yeah, how much did you pay him? Because I'll up at $20. I'll even buy a free beer. Here's an Irish idea, free beer. All right, I have to admit I went with an agenda, because there are some really difficult pieces to making this thing fly. One is that many of the disorders that might be that rule breaker, the PKU-like disorder that you were getting into at the end of your talk, are incredibly rare. They're 1 in 100,000, they may be even less, and yet a simple dietary supplement prevents the disease, right? Now, the issue is none of us are going to accrue enough patients individually really to understand the natural history of those disorders and prove out the value, the PKU-ness of this. PKU is a much more common disorder. So I came wanting us to data share. And I feel like that's still a very important goal, and we didn't quite get there. And the second thing I was really keen for us to do was to talk about stratification by race, ethnicity, and ancestry. Again, I don't care how many minority subjects we enroll in the United States. We are not going to have, let me just pick one group and hopefully not irritate anybody, but Filipinos, right? We're just not going to have enough. And furthermore, the idea that Filipinos are a homogeneous group is a complete fallacy. They are composed of a rich strata of subgroups. And so that's the other issue, is unless we all have a mechanism of sharing data, we're going to underrepresent everybody except folks like me from Northern Ireland, or folks like, not like you, I was going to say somebody. Anywho, so those are still elusive goals, and I think we're going to need to get together again. I think we made progress. I think we understand one another better, but we didn't quite tie the knot on those high goals.
Yeah, and I think that your vision of sharing the patients that we find and the variant landscape is absolutely critical. And I think one of the outcomes of the meeting was very clearly sort of some bonding between the different programs, which I think is sort of the bedrock of that vision. Alessandra, you get the last word, and then we're all going to start drinking.
Yeah, okay. I will be quick. No, I mean, well, the take-home message that I had from the fantastic experience yesterday is that we are facing a revolution in terms of medicine now, and somehow we will be, actors, right? Not protagonists, because probably this is too much, but actors for sure. And this will be probably the first massive translation of genomics into the health system, because this is newborn screening. So this point, as we have a huge responsibility, and as for any new era, we have to proceed on step by step, following the experimental procedure. So trying and correct if we are not doing the right things, and sharing and working together, because that's what we have to do. And so it's only 20 years ago that the human genome was sequenced, so 2020. So we are 2022, and we are facing this fantastic adventure for the babies, for sequencing babies. And I would like to tell that it's interesting that, and we discussed with Stephen yesterday, we disagree on that we had the Nobel Prize winner is Svante Pääbo for something that is very ancient, so it's phylogenetics and paleobotanics. So this is our life, putting together our story with our future, if I may say something philosophical, as we have discussed yesterday. So that's my final word. Thank you.
I knew that I had chosen the right person for the final word. And so I think everybody in this room is on a journey together to help newborns all over the world. And so when we go out and have a beer together, please try and get to know as many of the other people in this room, because you're the ones who are going to make this happen. Thank you.